awareness of that this is the case, so to speak, that this is what is going on inside the box, and only by just knowing that our awareness is enough to make the decision, or is it strictly an observing act that goes on here?
This, if you read any books on particle physics these days, this is the big issue. The big issue is what constitutes observation. Is observation the object that does the measuring inside the box? Can the cat itself be an observer? And nobody's really been able to answer this question as to what constitutes an observer. But what is fascinating, this is one thing that you might find amazing, is that you know that light can be a particle or a wave. Yes. And there's something called the twin slit experiment, whereby you fire a light beam through two slits, and then the light beam goes through, and then a pattern is made on something the other side of the two slits. Now, what is weird is that the light seems to travel as a wave and it arrives as a particle, which sounds very, very odd. And what they try to do is, in order to try and see whether it's a wave or a particle or not, they place a sensor in the two slits to spot.
You were just talking about the twin slit experiment, and maybe you can just do a quick recap on that and proceed.
Okay. The twin slit experiment, it's to do with the duality of light waves. And in fact, it's not just the duality of light waves. They've now discovered that even molecules have this duality, which is even weirder, which have massive implications for the nature of reality. But if you have two slits, and behind the two slits you have a board that you can reflect the two slits out. What they do is if you fire one photon at a time through through the two slits, what you find is that even a single photon will go through both slits at the same time, even though it's one photon, which of course is impossible, but that's what it does. The only alternative could be that it's a wave, in which case a wave would go through both slits. So in order to test it out, what has been done is you place a measuring device or a counter or something of that nature at one of both the slits to see which one the particle goes through. If it is observed, the particle ceases to be a wave and becomes a particle and goes through one slit or the other. If you put the monitor away and turn it away, it goes through as a wave. So in which case the particle knows whether it's being observed or not and decides whether to be a wave or a particle. Now, this is really freaky stuff, and it's if you start thinking about this, you really start to get rather worried about the nature of what we call reality.
Yes.
In fact, many particle physicists have said, this is just completely doesn't make any sense because our brains can't understand it. Because the amazing thing is, this idea of whether it's a particle or a wave, there's been work done now in Switzerland with things called buckyballs. And buckyballs are large molecules. And these large molecules only become solid molecules when somebody observes them. When they're not observed, they're waves. Which means that reality, if this is correct, and they've got no reason to think otherwise unless they take the many worlds interpretation, is that when you are not looking at something, it's not there. It is a wave of probability. And this is mind-blowing stuff.
And in one sense, then, would you tie this back to the brain again and consider that the brain is the mechanism or the machine or the computer that kind of interprets this or make it manifest in a way that it's through our participation in this game or this chance play that we're involved in here, that it becomes manifest at that instance when we are aware of it. Is that
spot on? A physicist called Eugene Wigner, I think it was. Wigner. It could have been John Wheeler. No, it was John Wheeler. And John Wheeler came up with the idea, called it the participatory universe. And the participatory universe is the idea that matter is brought into existence by mind. In fact, Wheeler, and I can't go into in detail now, but I do have a section of this on my blog site. Wheeler actually has postulated that we, by an act of observation, not only bring in the reality around us, but bring into existence things that happened millions of years ago. And he does an experiment, and he shows an experiment that could be done that would prove that we, by an act of observation, bring a quasar into existence whose light left millions of years ago from the quasar. It's something called gravitational lensing, which I haven't got time to go in for now, but I do deal with this. But your point about the brain bringing about reality, there's some fascinating work being done at the moment by a guy called Professor Stuart Hamerhoff at the University of Arizona. And he's been working closely with an English philosopher called Roger Penrose. And Penrose and Hamerhoff believe that they have found within the brain the structures that collapse the wave function within the brain to bring about our individual realities. And these things are called microtubules. And microtubules are so tiny that they believe that the act of consciousness, and they believe this is where consciousness starts. Consciousness is a quantum effect. Now, there is a big argument about these Hamerhoff, the Hamerhoff-Penrose argument. And a lot of critics have said that the brain is too hot and too warm and too moist for these things to happen. But it's only a question of trying to find out whether it can happen in these conditions, because the logic works. It's called orchestrated reduction. I think it's orchestrated reduction, and it's the fact. Again, I say to all your listeners, don't take my word for any of this I'm talking about. Check it out on the web. Make a note of the things I'm saying, and just go on the web and do a search. It's all there, and it's all hard science. It is absolutely amazing, this stuff. The problem is that what is happening is the neurologists aren't talking to the physicists, and the physicists aren't talking to the philosophers, who aren't talking to the psychiatrists, who aren't talking to the historians or the theologians. And then there's me in the middle going, hey guys, I'm this little guy over in Liverpool, and I've pulled all this together, and it works. You know, this really seriously. And I know it sounds incredibly vain, but other people have said this as well. This is singularly the most powerful theory that has been put forward for years. You know, it is just a question of how many people get to know about it.
And the question is, again, is this something, I mean, how have your thoughts around this started to develop in regards to how this can be, I guess, applied to the world that we do find ourselves in? Does this to you mean that we can change everything? Can we affect this? Can we, by consciousness alone, then start to affect the reality around us and play with it on a more conscious level? Or what do you think?
I think we can. At the moment, I have the amount of people who are joining in with me on this staggers me. I've got the most amazingly interesting people, from a Buddhist monk who came over from Australia to see me about the theories and the implications for Buddhism. I've been invited to a Sufi monastery in northern Cyprus because the Sufis, the mystic tradition of Islam, are interested in what I'm doing. People who are involved in deep meditation are fascinated by it all as well. All these things are being pulled together in the most powerful way. And it clearly, it's a question, we've made the first few steps. And that's why I have a forum, and that's why I have a blog site, because I'm inviting people to join us on this. This is an adventure, and it's open to everybody. I want people involved. I mean, for instance, we were discussing earlier about, I'm going to be interviewed by Whitley Strieber in the next few weeks. Now, Whitley's come across my theories from other people. But effectively, again, what happened to Whitley Strieber, I can explain. It's to do with temporal lobe epilepsy, because that's the other area I haven't talked about. I have a whole neurological theory. I have a theory about neurology that can possibly explain migraine, temporal lobe epilepsy, schizophrenia, bipolar. I've got medical professionals interested in this at the moment. I've got temporal lobe epileptics that I deal with, who, there's one guy on my forum, for instance, that's been on recently. He's got TLE, temporal lobe epilepsy. He's deja vuing hours in advance. he's living in a deja vu where he's fallen out of time. We're trying to help him at the moment because he's finding it so hard to deal with. I have people who have, like we were talking about Rick Strassman, weren't we, and the DMT, the spirit molecule.
Yes, yes.
My theory ties into his beautifully. You know, Rick and I are in contact, and we're swapping emails at the moment.
And regards, if we talk a little bit more about temporal lobe epilepsy, is that is it because of some kind of chemical imbalance that this means that the person is then jumping back and forth in regards to these different realities, or how do you interpret this? Is this an error, or is this meant to be? Is this the experience that they're having? Because some of these people are actually trying to, well, through their experiences, they're actually learning and figuring out the nature of reality, right?
Yeah, it's meant to be. Effectively, I would argue that people don't have temporal lobe epilepsy, they experience it. Now, anybody out there that has temporal lobe epilepsy will know these things, because I have temporal lobe epileptics that end up at my talks and don't even know why they're there. And I argue that the reason for this is that there are two sides to the brain, right and left hemisphere. Well, I don't argue, that's a known fact. And the two sides of the hemisphere are two hemispheres are joined together by something called the corpus callosum. Now, what I suggest is that the daemon, the higher self, inhabits one part of the brain, and the everyday self inhabits the dominant hemisphere, ordinarily in most of us, the left side. Now, the corpus callosum is the thing that holds the two sides of the brain together. There is another thing underneath, but that's irrelevant, really. It's just the main thing that holds the side of the brains together. Now, what I argue is that depending upon the chemical makeup within the brain of an individual will depend on the communication channels across the corpus callosum between the eidolon and the daemon. And I suspect, although I need to talk to Rick Strassman about this, because I think it could just as much be DMT, but effectively there's another neurotransmitter in the brain called glutamate. And I think that glutamate facilitates communication between the daemon and the eidolon. There's a famous term used by William Blake called the doors of perception.
Yes.
And in fact, it was the term the American band The Doors named themselves after. And William Blake said if the doors of perception were flung open, man would see the universe as it is, infinite. And what I argue is that when you have initially, I call it the continuum of creativity, or transcendentalism. And what I suggest is that depending on how much of these chemicals you have in your brain will depend on how wide the doors are open, how wide the communication channels are. And I suggest that most normal people, and I'm using that just as the statistical majority, the doors are closed. They don't experience deja vu, they don't experience the daemon, they don't experience precognition, they don't experience the magic of what the universe is really about. But as the chemicals start to kick in, the doors start to become slightly ajar. And I think when the doors are slightly ajar, that's classical migraine. And there's a wonderful book written by a guy called Oliver Sacks about migraine. And if you read that book, he tells you, and I know I'm a migrainer, and I can agree with this totally, that you start to perceive reality in a slightly different way when you have migraine.
Oh, yeah.
You know, you have these, your eyesight starts to break down, you start to feel peculiar, you have a migraine aura. And part of the migraine aura is deja vus, standard deja vu sensations. I feel I've been here before. However, as the chemicals become stronger and there's more of them, the doors become more open. And that's temporal lobe epilepsy. Because with temporal lobe epilepsy, I don't know if you know about temporal lobe epilepsy, but ordinarily, somebody who has pure TLE only has absences. They have petit mal. They don't have grand mal seizures where they fall to the floor.
Okay.
All they do is they stare at you for a second. And the interesting thing is, and temporal lobe epileptics have told me this time and time again, if you're talking to a temporal lobe epileptic and they go into a petit mal seizure, they'll just stare at you for a split second. They're away for hours. They're absolutely away forever. One of my individuals turned around to me and she said when that happened to her the first time, she was away for what felt like 7 or 8 hours. And it was literally 0.5 of a second as far as her friend was concerned. And the world she saw when she was